One thing that upsets me when Dungeons & Dragons moves forward through its editions are the sheer amount of creatures that get lost to the annals of time. Whether it's too edgy for the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons or simply it just doesn't get reprinted for some reason. There's a lot of really cool monsters from the old 4E books, 3.5, 3rd edition, and even probably 1st edition. I haven't delved back that far, but you get my point. There's a lot of really cool, awesome monsters from these older editions that have just never seen the light of day once they were printed. So I'm starting a new series called Retro Revival. This is going to be the series where I'm going to take monsters from your older editions of Dungeons & Dragons and I'm going to try my best to convert them to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. My first choice today is going to be the Bloodbloater. It is a small creature, but very deadly. Let's dive into the lore for this creature, shall we? So the Bloodbloater comes from 3.5's Fiend Folio. You can find it on page 17 of the book. These are aquatic oozes. They normally live in the waters of the ocean, but they can also lurk in deep, dank underground areas with stagnant pools of water. They are generally mindless, though content to float with the current and eat whatever passes within striking distance. So for the little tidbit of lore that we get from the Fiend Folio, it says the Bloodbloater is a fairly small, flat, disc-shaped ooze, about 8 inches in diameter with a bulge at the center. It is milky white with flecks of red. Individually, a Bloodbloater poses little threat. However, these oozes tend to congregate in swarms of about 650 creatures, and as such, they can be quite a menace to unwary swimmers. Now, 3.5 Dungeon Masters are a little more spoiled than 5e because they used to get combat tactics added into every page of these books for each creature. So, the Bloodbloater's combat tactics states that a Bloodbloater swarm simply swims around or slithers over its target and begins to drain blood at a shocking rate. Bloodbloaters have no concept of satiation. Upon becoming engorged on blood and turning milky red in color, they continue to feed as excess blood is forced out of their bodies into the surrounding water. And they have an attack known as Blood Drain. It says on each round that the Bloodbloater swarm deals at least 1 point of damage to a victim, it also drains blood and causes 1 point of strength damage. So I took the lore that we had from the Fiend Folio and I tried my best to take it and convert it into a 5e creature. So we're going to start off with the smallest individual creature that we have here. This is just a Bloodbloater on its lonesome. These little bloodthirsty pancake-shaped oozes. These are tiny oozes. They are neutral. They have an armor class of 12, hit points of 5. They have a movement speed of 5 feet, but they have a swim speed of 30 feet, so they move very fast in the water. Very low strength with a 4. They have a 15 dexterity, 16 con, 1 intelligence, 10 wisdom, 1 charisma. So very, very low stats in specific areas that could be used against them. Saving throw proficiencies, I gave them a dexterity and a constitution saving throw. Stealth proficiency, they have a vulnerability to fire damage. Now, it does actually state this in the Fiend Folio, so I took that and I ran with it as an idea that if these creatures dry out, they pretty much can't survive on their own. So they need water to remain intact, otherwise it shrivels up. So they have a resistance to acid and cold, condition immunities, blinded, charmed, deafened, exhaustion, frightened, prone. They have a sense of blind sight out to 60 feet, but they cannot see beyond that radius. I would imagine if you're splashing around in the water, they could probably sense that with a wisdom perception check. These are challenge rating 1/4, so a little stronger than a 1/8, and we'll see why. They have proficiency bonus of +2. Let's move into the special traits. So, its first special trait you're going to see is dehydration. This is where I had that idea in my head. If a Bloodbloater is left outside of water for more than 4 hours, it shrivels up and dies. Pretty self-explanatory. If you can somehow drain a room full of water that these creatures are surviving in and wait it out, they will all shrivel up. And you can use these almost like a dungeon hazard than an actual creature, but the creature stat block is here for whenever, inevitably, your headstrong players charge in headfirst, literally, into the water. So they are amphibious, as it states on the wiki. They are amorphous because they are oozes, so they can squeeze under gaps as narrow as 1 inch wide. They have Blood Frenzy. This is a shark ability, but I gave it to the Bloodbloaters because it's literally in their name. I think it makes sense, and it gives them something unique to their stat block. So they have advantage on melee attacks versus creatures that aren't at full HP. Then they also have Spider Climb, so they can climb up on walls and ceilings and cliff faces. Are they going to do that? More than likely not most of the time, but they could. So if you're hiding up in a tree in a swamp, the Bloodbloaters could start climbing up that tree very slowly, mind you, at 5 feet. Now let's get into the actions. This is not a creature that needs to be overcomplicated, but it's a creature that's effective for what it does. So we have a melee attack with its pseudopods, +4 to hit, range of 5 feet. The first action that you'll see is Suction Latch. So these little pseudopod tendrils that stick out that you can just barely see in the artwork deal 1d4 piercing damage, and the Bloodbloater pierces the flesh, attaching itself to the target. So think like a giant tick, except this is an ooze. It can be removed as an action with a DC 7 strength check or be targeted by attack rolls or spells as normal. I just have that in here just in case you're a newer dungeon master, and the stat block's pretty small, so I have space to actually give more explanation text. Now here's the iconic ability, Blood Drain. This is a special action. It can only be used while it is attached, so it has to use Suction Latch first. The Bloodbloater sucks blood from its target, requiring no attack roll. The creature takes 2d6 necrotic damage, and its strength score is reduced by 1 until it takes a short or a long rest, and then it tells you what happens if that score reaches 0. The creature must also make a DC 13 con save. On a failure, the creature is poisoned until it takes a long or a short rest, so a rest. It has to take a rest. While poisoned this way, it has disadvantage on con saves, and here's the kicker. If it fails by 5 or more, the creature gains a point of exhaustion. So every time they get Blood Drain, they have to make this DC 13 con save. After the first time they fail it, they're going to have disadvantage on that con save. And that's concentration checks, that's everything involving constitution, which is a lot of things. So concentration is pretty much a secondary stat for almost every class in the game, unless you're crazy and you're doing con as a dump stat, which you're an honorable Giga Chad if you do that. But you're going to suffer against a creature like this. So it's really meant to represent you're getting weaker as this thing is vampirically draining you of your bodily fluids. So that exhaustion will more than likely trigger after the first couple times you fail, because if you fail by 5 or more, you're going to have disadvantage. So eventually with disadvantage, your chances of rolling a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are exponentially higher, even with your modifiers. So that's just a singular Bloodbloater. Let's look at some of the other ones that I've made. Alright, so the iconic thing about these creatures is they form swarms typically, so very rarely you're going to find just one, but if you want some interesting low-level creatures for your first-level characters, you have the single Bloodbloater stat block to use. Now, this is a Bloodbloater minor hemo swarm. Minor tells us that there are varying sizes to these swarms. Remember what the lore said, up to 650 of these usually congregate into a swarm, so this would be a small swarm of these. So this is a medium swarm. In terms of D&D sizes, this is a medium swarm, but it would be considered a small swarm. So, hit points of 52, it's got a bloodied condition, so I have the bloodied condition thing in there. You can see we're just going to go real quick through this. So the strength score has gone up by 7 points, so it's from a 4 up to a 11. Everything else has stayed the same. It does have vulnerabilities to area of effect and multi-target attacks and spells, and then also it has damage resistance to single target attacks and spells. So let's move into the special traits. Okay, special traits. You see a lot of horde stat blocks from me, but we haven't seen too many swarm stat blocks from me. The last one that was featured in a video was the Onkeg Broodling Swarm. I've made a couple changes to swarms since then, so let's go over the swarm text here, because this is very important. This is very integral to how the creature works. The swarm can occupy another creature's space, move through openings large enough for a tiny amorphous ooze. It is immune to effects that alter its form, single target spells and conditions, and it cannot regain hit points or gain temporary hit points. So that single target spell effects and conditions should actually be put onto my horde stat blocks. I was thinking, there are spells that specifically state, like Temporal Shunt, for example. One of my player characters has this in their repertoire of spells, and if they use that on this swarm, it technically shouldn't work because that only targets one creature. So swarms and hordes and packs should all actually say they cannot be the target of single target spell effects or conditions. So if it was a spell that gave something the blinded condition, but it only targets one creature, it shouldn't blind the entire swarm, though this swarm can't be blinded, but for example. Now, in addition to all of this, when the swarm uses its action to make an attack, it can target up to 4 creatures of its choice within its space, using the same attack roll for all targets. Now that goes up the bigger the swarm is. So, dehydration is the same. Infestation is its second special trait that is unique to the swarm only. Now, infestation has a couple changes to it. Let's go through this. When the swarm moves into a smaller, larger, so going up, so it can't infest tiny creatures, but everything that's not tiny it can. So a small or larger creature's space, or it starts its turn there. As long as the horde is not, or as long as the swarm is not bloodied, it may infest the target. You roll 1d4, and the target is infested with Bloodbloaters equal to the number rolled. The swarm's max HP is reduced by that number rolled times 3, and that 3 comes from its Constitution modifier. So that's to represent that creatures within the horde are breaking off of the horde and becoming individual creatures. So obviously it would take from the horde's HP. Now it says infesting creatures automatically fail saving throws, can be individually targeted. Each point of damage removes 1 infesting creature new in an area of effect. Removing them manually takes 6 seconds per creature. So if that character gets hit with an AoE, every point of damage done to that character would remove 2 creatures that are infesting it, for example. Or if he gets hit with an axe, every point of damage that he takes is going to remove 1 creature that is infesting them. So you can self-damage yourself to get creatures off of you, or have your allies start magic missiles at you to get rid of some of the creatures on you. Really, magic missile doesn't miss, so you could just target the creatures individually. But anyways, moving on to the final thing here. This was a alteration to something from the Fiend Folio version. So anemic vibrations is my own creation, but it's derived from something that it had that didn't translate well in the 5e. So anemic vibrations states that a creature poisoned by the Bloodbloaters that starts its turn in the swarm's space loses concentrations on spells, and it cannot take bonus actions until it leaves the swarm's space. So I picture they can all vibrate, kind of bees can vibrate and heat a creature up that they're vibrating on. Same thing here, except it makes you dizzy, it makes you nauseous. It's just something that I kind of with in my head. So moving into the actions here, this is going to become much more dangerous now. The to hit is still very low. It's only +5, so if your characters have a 21 AC, they can still block it, but the infestation is going to happen no matter what. Now, so it does 4d4 piercing damage on a hit, If it is bloodied, it only does 2d4. And then it says the swarm may choose to have 1d4 Bloodbloaters break off and attach to the target. And you reduce the swarm's HP equal to the number rolled times 3. See infestation for removal. So this is a way to double up on infestation mechanic with this creature. And that gets worse the larger size this swarm is. Now this is a minor swarm, so this is the smallest version of that swarm. Now we go into blood draining instead of blood drain. This is while attached only, so only the creatures that are attached to your characters or whatever this is fighting. So via infestation or suction latches. The Bloodbloaters suck the blood from their targets. Each creature takes 2d6 necrotic damage, and their strength score is reduced by 1 for every Bloodbloater attached to it until it takes a short or long rest. And yes, so that still drains your strength. That's very bad. That's very deadly. And also the Constitution save is higher because it's a swarm, but if it's bloodied, it's reduced down to its normal amount. So if you are staying in this swarm space for a little bit too long and you start getting like 5, 6, 7 Bloodbloaters attached to you, that's 2d6 times the amount of Bloodbloaters attached to you, and your strength score is reduced by 1 for every Bloodbloater attached to you. So it is meant to represent that you are literally getting the blood drained from your body by these little creatures, and you are going to shrivel up into a husk very quickly if you do not do something about the swarm. And not to mention, these are aquatic, so if your characters don't have a swim speed, that water is difficult terrain. They're not going to outrun these Bloodbloaters. Very dangerous creature to add into any sort of sunken tomb, flooded catacombs, underground, water in it. Anything where there is water, these creatures can exist. So very deadly. Let's look at a bigger version of this swarm and see how much it scales up. So we just looked at the smallest version of the Bloodbloater swarm. Let's jump all the way up to the top. This is the highest echelon version of this creature stat block. This is a Sanguine Tsunami. This is a 650 Bloodbloater swarm. It is gargantuan. We're not going to go through the whole stat block. We're just going to skim through it quickly because a lot of it is just redundant information. So I'm going to go over the key changes. So its hit points are massively higher. Its strength score has increased to 21. Under its swarm special trait, it can now attack each target creature of its choice within its space, using the same attack roll for all targets. And for infestation, when the swarm enters your space and when it starts its turn in your space, you are infested with 4d4 Bloodbloaters. Okay, sound like a lot, but it actually is a ton. Now let's move down to the actions. The pseudopods are plus 11 to hit, so much higher chance of actually hitting to get extra creatures attached to you and infesting you. This deals 16 d4 piercing damage on a hit, so that's 45 damage on a hit. Or if it's bloodied, it does half of that at 25 on average. And the swarm may choose to have 4d4 Bloodbloaters break off and attach to the target. Reduce the swarm's HP equal to the number rolled times 3. Keeping in mind, potentially 12 4's worth of Bloodbloaters can be rolled to infest a single creature in a round of combat, because if it's in your space at the start of its turn, it infests you. If it moves into your space, it infests you. And now if it hits you with suction latches, it infests you. So now if you have all of these creatures attached to you, you're going to take 2d6 necrotic damage at the start of your... Well, the horde has to use blood draining, but you're going to take 2d6 necrotic damage per creature attached to you, and your strength score is going to be reduced by 1 for every one of those creatures attached to you. And then you also have to make a DC 21 con save, and if you fail, you're poisoned. If you fail by 5 or more, you still get a point of exhaustion, keep in mind. So very, very brutal. That's a lot of creatures. Literally, visually, just imagine you have hundreds of these tiny ooze-like tick creatures draining the blood from your body rapidly until you just collapse. There's nothing you can do other than fireball the ground beneath you and hope you vaporize those that are on you off, or you cast the fly spell and you hover up in the air. So this creature's pretty easily outmaneuvered. That's one of its weaknesses, but that's okay. More of a hazard than an actual fully fleshed out creature that you're going to make a whole campaign around. This isn't a creature that you're going to make a whole campaign around. Although you could make it a byproduct of your campaign and say this is a creation of a crazy wizard. He's been releasing them into the water supply and they're just draining the life out of every aquatic life form in a certain mile radius, and the player characters have to go on this quest to figure out how to defeat this mad wizard scientist who's releasing these creatures. But that's going to do it for this episode of Retro Revival. This was the first in a series of many. Remember, leave in the comments down below what creatures you want to see in this series, because I know there's a lot of really cool creatures in older editions. Also, if you go to my Patreon page, you're going to get all the creatures featured in this video. I can't talk, sorry. Along with extra stat blocks, because I didn't want to just make the 2 stat blocks. I wanted to make sure there is a Bloodbloater swarm for all levels of play, along with 1 extra Bloodbloater that I made called a Bloodbloater Gorger. And yeah, that's the first in this series. It was a fun creature to rework. Took me a little bit of time, but I fleshed it out, made it functioning, and it actually feels like it could fit into a 5e game. Let me know if you use this creature, if you play tested it, let me know how it goes, tell me how scared your players were, or if they completely and utterly annihilated it. It's been DM Dungeon Mastery. I'm not saying goodnight, I'm just saying thank you.